Good evening, everyone. My name is David Wood, and I am the Special Projects Manager for Early Music America. We want to welcome you to the next in our series of webinars. This evening, we'll be talking about Sephardic music, and we will be hearing from our presenter, Ian Pomerantz, in just a few moments. I wanted to remind you, if you haven't, or to tell you for the first time, if you haven't been with us, how to participate in this evening's webinar. You can use the Q&A feature to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and I will be keeping track of those, and we'll save those for the last 10 or 15 minutes of the hour. And we'll try to group those into as logical a grouping as possible. If you would like to put things in the chat, feel free to do that. But we would like you to put your questions in the Q&A so that we can keep track of what those are throughout the presentation. And feel free to put those in there at any time, and we'll continue to monitor that. If you have any technical questions, you can always feel free to send me a private chat using the chat here on Zoom. If you're following us and watching on Facebook Live right now, you can use the comments to submit your questions throughout, and we'll be monitoring those as well and introduce those as part of the question and answer period at the end of the session. You can always find out more about our interest sessions, our other programming, scholarships, news, events, and more at earlymusicamerica.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and we'll be archiving this recording along with our other interest sessions and webinars on our YouTube channel, and that will be there later tomorrow. If you were joining us through Zoom, you will also receive a link tomorrow to watch this on demand in the follow-up on Zoom, but then you can also watch it again on YouTube at a later time if you would like to do that. If you'd like to find out more about Early Music America and hear more from the early music community throughout North America, you can get our weekly eNotes newsletter. The next one will be going out tomorrow morning. You can do that by using the button at the bottom of earlymusicamerica.org, or you can send a text to 42828 and just put early music all in caps as your message, and that will begin a process for which you can sign up for the weekly newsletter. So I'd like to welcome our presenter for this evening, bass baritone Ian Pomerantz. He's the artistic director of Les Enfants d'Orphée, specializing in French Baroque chamber music, has degrees from Westminster Choir College, Longy School of Music at Bard College, and has taught at the Hart School. And this evening, he will be speaking to us about Sephardic music, a topic that I'm sure that many of you, we have a great attendance, are excited to hear about. And Ian and I were just saying before we started that coincidentally, later this week is Hanukkah, and that was not by design. It just happened to be that way. And so, if you are someone who celebrates, we'd like to wish you a happy Hanukkah later in this week. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Ian, and welcome once again, and take it away.
Hello, everyone. Dave, can you hear me? Just making sure.
You sound great.
Great. Thank you to Early Music America for sponsoring this series of webinars, and this webinar in particular. It's a wonderful way to connect with the early music community and learn more at this difficult time. And I'm sure it's kept me and a lot of other people afloat. So thank you, Early Music America. And thank you for joining us. Some of you I have known for a long time, and some of you have not met yet. So if you drop me a line after our webinar, just to say hi, I would love to chat with you, and I would love to know who you are. So today we are talking about Sephardic music. Let me just get this up. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen. There we go. So this topic has been a hot one in early music for about 50 years, since about the 1970s. and it's developed its own life. And I put this together so we could look at fact versus fiction when it comes to this wonderful repertoire. What is early and what is not early about Sephardic music? So this map that you see in front of you comes from the Encyclopedia Judaica. It is by no means perfect, but it is pretty good. First, we're going to turn our attention to this yellow area here. Now, this yellow area, especially over here in the on your lower right corner, this is the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is where most Sephardic Jews found refuge in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries when they left Spain and Portugal, what we know today as Iberia. So before we really start digging into Sephardic music, let's just set some parameters. What is Jewish music? The scholar Judah Cohen says his working definition is that it is music that expresses the Jewish identity of a community or a composer. So on the left, we have examples of Jewish music, and on the right, to contrast, we have examples of music that's not necessarily Jewish music, but that's written by Jews. So let's take Salomone Rossi's Shir HaShirim. This is Jewish music. It is written by a Jewish man, Salomone Rossi, an early Baroque composer, in Hebrew, which is a Jewish language, for synagogue worship. So it has three ways of expressing Jewish identity. So we can call it Jewish music. Now, on the right hand, we have Salomone Rossi's Trio Sonatas. Now here we find the same person in the court of Mantua, but he's writing something that has nothing to do with his Jewish identity or the Jewish community. His Trio Sonatas. He essentially invented the Trio Sonatas. So here we are, it's not really Jewish music, but it just happens to be music written by Jews. Let's look at another example. Let's look at Schubert's setting of Psalm 92. Now here Schubert, who by no means was Jewish, was collaborating with Sulzer, who was the cantor at the Grand Vienna Synagogue, for his choir, setting a Jewish psalm in Hebrew for liturgical context. Yes, Schubert's not Jewish, but he is writing Jewish music. It's in a Jewish language, with a Jewish cantor, for a Jewish choir, for a Jewish community, for their liturgy. Now, Jacobi Beshevi, on your right hand, he was another Venetian Jew, very much like Salomone Rossi. But he's just writing sonatas, not necessarily Jewish music. We can continue this by looking at Billy Joel's Piano Man. Sing me a song, you're the piano man. Sing me a song tonight. Billy Joel's Piano Man is a wonderful song, and Billy Joel is very Jewish. Both of his parents were Jewish, and his Jewish identity is very important to him by his own admission. The Piano Man isn't really Jewish music. So now let's narrow this down. Let's take the same parameters that we use to define Jewish music to define Sephardic music. So instead of music that expresses an overall Jewish identity of a community or a composer, let's say it's a Sephardic identity of a community or a composer. So we have, on our last bottom left, we have the works of Tamburi Isaac. That's Isaac Fresco-Romano. And he is a Sephardic Jew working in the 18th century court of the Ottoman Empire. And he is composing Ottoman court music. Now, there's nothing necessarily Jewish about this music. It's Ottoman court music that happens to be written by a Sephardic Jew. But later, after he died, some of his music entered the Sephardic repertoire, entered the synagogue as maftirim, that's sacred Jewish contrafacta. And all of a sudden, we have a dead Jewish composer writing music that has become Jewish. So yes, in that case, the works of Tamburi Isaac are Jewish music. There's always this conversation about what is Jewish identity in music, and we will further and continue that discussion today. So, before I talk too long, let's get started on our mythologies, shall we? So our first biggest myth is that Sephardic music comes from pre-expulsion Spain. And the fact is that no musical material in Judeo-Spanish secular song, that is music that is not liturgical, not sacred, and written in the Ladino language or Judeo-Spanish language, can be traced to pre-expulsion Iberia. So it's neither medieval nor from Spain, but rather a modern Ottoman repertoire. Most Judeo-Spanish secular song dates from what we call this golden period of Jewish Sephardic song in the Ottoman Empire. And that is right at the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century, between 1875 and 1925. The major centers of this creative output are the urban centers of the Eastern Mediterranean: Sarajevo, Thessalonica, Constantinople or Istanbul, Izmir or Smyrna, and even Jerusalem and Damascus and Cairo. There's a wonderful mix of urban culture, nightclubs, and as Jews start to really experience modernity or Western modernity, we also have an influx of musical ideas from the West and from the other Ottoman provinces that inform Jewish music and make it so rich. However, none of the music that is written during this period is actually coming to us from pre-expulsion Spain. It is a very modern repertoire. Now there's a caveat to that, and that is that some of the texts do have roots in Iberia, or perhaps corollaries in the Gentile pan-Iberian or pan-Hispanic world. Now these pieces, mostly in a very limited genre that we call romances, are all contrafacta. By contrafacta, I mean that they are older texts set to new melodies that Jews encountered in the Ottoman Empire. But it is only the texts. No melodic material comes from pre-expulsion Spain or the medieval period. Sephardic music, as early music, really is a 20th century phenomenon. We start to see glimmerings of it around the first 2 decades of the 20th century, when certain academics like Manuel Manrique de Lara, a Spanish nobleman who toured the Eastern Ottoman Empire and North Africa, and Abraham Tzvi Idelsohn, who was a Jewish musicologist and really laid the foundation of what we call Jewish ethnomusicology today, started looking at Sephardic music. Then there were 2 wars, and Sephardic music changed greatly. The communities, including my community in the Balkans, was completely decimated. Later, starting in 1962, the acclaimed Spanish soprano Victoria de los Angeles, who was a wonderful singer, took some Sephardic music from a collection called the Levi Collection and recorded it as with pseudo-medieval accompaniment. And that was the first time Sephardic music has been seen as early music. Now, there was a young gambist, pretty much unknown at the time, who played on this recording, and his name was Jordi Savall. And he would go on a decade later to issue a disc called Jewish and Christian Music in Medieval Spain or Medieval Iberia. And that's really when Sephardic music with medieval accompaniments and as medieval music or early music really started blossoming. Let's continue. So our next myth is that Sephardic folk songs are all romances. The fact is that romances are only one genre out of many, many genres that are Sephardic music. There are cantigas, which are just folk songs, endechas, which are laments, cantes de cuña, lullabies, cantigas de boda, wedding songs, coplas, which you can call secular carols. Now, the term romance has greatly expanded into unrelated genres. My longtime mentor and dear friend, Judith Cohen, who has written extensively on this subject, calls this romancing the romance. Romance is such an evocative word. Like, who does not want to put that on their program? But romance itself, what we call the body of romance, is the repertoire itself, called the romancero, is a strict genre of long narrative poems. They can be quite long. Some of them are 20, 25 stanzas. They're long narrative poems, usually about 8 or 12 syllables long. And they're most often sung by women, unaccompanied or with simple percussion. Let's do a little case study. On the right of my screen, you see La Rosa Enflorece, Sephardic romances. But La Rosa Enflorece is a lively pop song from nightclubs in Istanbul, but it's very often slowed down and played as a romance. The tempo should probably be something like La Rosa Enflorece, but it's often slowed down to La rosa en florece. Now, what does a real romance sound like? Well, let's hear Benvenida Aguado of Blessed Memory sing a true Sephardic romance, La muerte del Duque de Gandia, shall we? This comes from the Collection Susanna Weishahak, who was a wonderful musicologist and founded an archive in the National Sound Archive at the National University Library of Jerusalem, where they reside today.
Pescando sus proverías. Vieron venir tres en caballo, haciendo gran pelea.
Beautiful stuff, isn't it? Let's see, go back to share the screen. Now, it really is beautiful stuff, but it's a very domestic art form. And you can see how a romance like that, which is quite long and usually unaccompanied and usually made for domestic performance, might not be completely at home in a concert, completely unaccompanied, which is a reason why the romance genre has suddenly expanded to include so many other genres of Sephardic music that, in our terminology, have become romances. Now, our myth 3 is that Sephardic folk songs are anonymous. Our fact is that a large body of Sephardic folk songs have known composers, but are anonymized in concert, and many songs are still under copyright. Now, this brings us to several issues of performance, right? Because if they're under copyright, we can get in trouble if we perform them without following the law. Now, this is not a case study this is not the case with Rosa Enflorece, but let's do a case study at a greater depth. La Rosa Enflorece was written by Chaim Bechar Menachem, also known as Chaim Effendi. So this song that was billed as an anonymous romance now actually has a face. It has a name, and it has a composer, and it even has a date. Chaim Effendi was working at a nightclub in Istanbul, and he wrote this around 1905. Now let's listen to this composer sing his own work. So here it is, La Rosa Enflorece, also known as Las Bilbilicos, which we now know is not an anonymous song, and it's not a romance, but rather it is a modern Ottoman repertoire written by Chaim Effendi around 1905, by his own admission. What a wonderful piece. Now, Chaim Effendi was working, he was not alone. He was part of an entire generation of Sephardic singers who wrote this repertoire. Most of what we know as anonymous Sephardic music actually comes from this milieu. Adieu Querida, which is inspired by La Traviata, comes from this. Árboles, a la una yo nací, some settings of Tres Hermanicas, Alta Alta va la Luna, all come from this cultural milieu. And it's really wonderful to listen to. Our next myth, that Sephardic music and flamenco or fado are stylistically related. And our fact is that Sephardic folk song is not stylistically or genetically related to flamenco or fado. Now, by genetically, I mean one doesn't necessarily come from the other, or one does not come from the other at all. The oldest record that we have of flamenco music actually dates to 1774 in a book called Las Cartas Marruecas by Jose Cadolso, nearly 3 centuries after the expulsion of the Jews from the Ottoman Peninsula. Now, flamenco is also intimately tied to a different ethnic community that comes from Iberia, and that is the Andalusian Gitano community, or Roma community. There's no mention of Gitanos in Andalusia prior to 1462, when several families were welcomed into the city of Jaén. And even then, there were probably fewer than 3,000 individuals of Romani descent on the entire Iberian Peninsula. And they really hadn't developed their own unique flamenco culture yet. And Sephardic flamenco fusion starts around the 1970s and is embraced in Spain. Going back to our previous slide, we also come to Flora Jagoda. She is a modern composer from Sarajevo, and her music is very often anonymized and flamencoized as well. Sometimes it's medievalized, but it's often flamencoized. Notably in these festivals called Tres Culturas festivals, where Jewish music and Islamic music and Christian music are played. Now, I find this incredibly interesting because Flora Jagoda's music becomes traditional very fast. I once asked a Spanish person who was singing Ocho Candelicas, which is a Hanukkah song written as a Sephardic tango for Hanukkah in 1983. And she said her grandmother was singing it to her. And I was always interested to know where her grandmother would have gotten that from, because she couldn't have learned it prior to 1983. Fado is even newer. Fado comes from the 1820s in the small fishing villages of Portugal. And they really don't have a chance to interact with Sephardic music. So flamenco Sephardic fusion is a new phenomenon. Now here on this poster, they're being really honest, and I really appreciate it. It says Sephardic and flamenco fusion experience of traditional Ladino music with a fusion of authentic flamenco guitar and dance. If you're going to do flamenco and Sephardic fusion, this is a wonderful way to present it. So let's see some best practices. What do the most successful performers of Judeo-Spanish music do? Well, most of them have some background in Makam study. Makam is the native music theory system, theoretical system of the Eastern Mediterranean. This becomes a problem in Sephardic music because much of the repertoire has been either intentionally or unintentionally stripped of its Makam performance practice and then put into modern use. So it could be essential to have some background in Makam study, which is why if you've received a piece of Sephardic music and you're saying, well, this isn't Makam, there's a reason for that. It's because it's either intentionally stripped of its Makam context, which means that probably usually the publisher doesn't want to make it too inaccessible to Western musicians, or the publisher doesn't know about Makam. And the second thing to have a background in that becomes useful is language study. Ladino is a language, it's not Spanish, and it doesn't use the same pronunciation. So having a language background is also really helpful. Many of the most successful composers maintain contact or input from living tradition bearers and the Sephardic community. And this is a two-way street that develops over a long time, and it takes a while to establish trust. But it's a wonderful thing to do, and it is the best practice of Sephardic music, and it is also the most ethical way to go forward with that. It's also important to stay up to date on current research in the field of Sephardic ethnomusicology. There are many researchers who are writing about this right now. Some of them are Judith Cohen, who I've already mentioned, Edwin Cerruti, Francesco Spagnuolo, Mark Kirschenbaum, Judah Cohen, Kay Shalamai, and many others. And the best thing to do is to apply the standard ethnomusicological methodologies and ethics that one would anywhere else. It helps to engage Sephardic musicians who are well-versed in this repertoire. For those who live in the Northeast or Seattle, you are blessed with a wonderful, active Sephardic community around you. And they're very open, in my experience, to collaboration with musicians. The best and most successful Sephardic performers of Judeo-Spanish music also avoid Orientalist and exoticist tropes. I usually talk about two exoticisms. There's the exoticism of geography, that is, Sephardic music is exotic because it comes from somewhere else, somewhere far away, like Spain or Greece or Turkey or the Balkans or the Middle East. And then there's the exoticism of time. That is our first myth, that it comes from a time so unlike our own, the medieval period. Or putting Jewish music into Christian context. I've seen a few Sephardic Christmas concerts without the involvement of the community. I also think it's helpful to avoid using Sephardic music to insert one's own beliefs about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without first engaging the Sephardic community. As frustration grows in the West with Netanyahu and Middle Eastern affairs, it often creeps into Sephardic music making without first engaging the community's view on that and whether they want their music to be used for a political purpose. And it's important to take that into consideration. I would also encourage you to look at repertoire from the Eastern Mediterranean that's not in Ladino. Maftirim, Piutim, Bakashot, Pismonim are all genres, usually liturgical or paraliturgical, that await exploration by Western musicians. Now is the time that I'm actually excited, because now we get to go over music that is early and is Sephardic. Now, we're going back to this map of the Sephardic diaspora. So far, we've talked about what's in yellow here, the Ottoman Empire. But now we're going to go west a little bit and north, over here to France, to the United Kingdom, to Hamburg, to the New World, and most notably in Amsterdam and Holland. Myth number 5. So there's no early Sephardic music still in existence? The fact is that there is a sizable corpus of Sephardic music from the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic periods. This music originates in the communities of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, centered in Amsterdam and London, but also having important centers in London, Hamburg, Livorno, New York, Rhode Island, Brazil, and the Caribbean. There's a large repertoire of liturgical, paraliturgical, and even some secular music in Hebrew, in Portuguese, in Spanish, Dutch, and even some in English and French. The painting you see on the left of the screen is the interior of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam by Edmund de Witt in 1680 in the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam today. And it was painted just 5 years after the beautiful synagogue was inaugurated with much Baroque splendor. The Western Sephardic musical tradition is incredibly unique. I want to draw your attention to this marriage contract, to this ketubah that was made in Amsterdam for the marriage of Samuel Senor Teixeira and Rachel de Mato Senor. Let's look at what we see. So we see the bride and the groom, and we believe these are actually portraits of living people in the community, exchanging rings. Here are 2 rabbis, one is holding wine, and one is reading the prayers. The family is involved, in-laws here, and the wife's in-laws here. And what really intrigues me is at the bottom of this screen, you see the wedding party, which are actually portraits. And we see that there is a violinist and a continuo player, as well as a gentleman singing. Wedding contracts like this are important to our understanding about how Jewish communities are feeling and how secure they are. My grandparents came from immigrant families, and they had a printed ketubah. It was nice, but it was something that had lines on it that could be folded and put in your pocket. And if you were chased out of this country, as they didn't quite know that they were never going to be, they could take it and leave. Then my parents' ketubah is a little more ornate. It has watercolors, it doesn't have fold marks, and it's big enough to be framed. And my wife and I, when we got married, we decided to commission a piece of art from a Sephardic artist that is now in a large frame and is very beautiful, because we feel secure and want to celebrate our place in the American Jewish community. The same thing goes for these Jews. These Jews, at least this family, felt that they were assimilated enough to be tolerated while still keeping their own traditions, and felt secure enough to invest quite a bit of energy and resources into a ketubah. Now, let's talk a little bit about these communities. They were originally 3 Sephardic communities, just in Amsterdam alone. The first already existed in 1610, and perhaps as early as 1602. These 3 communities began cooperating and collaborating more closely in 1622, and then in 1639, they merged to form the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, which still exists today. The current building was inaugurated in 1675, of which Abraham Cohen Pimentel, also a composer, was the head rabbi, and there was much musical fanfare. They have a unique tradition of liturgical and paraliturgical for cantor, and an all-male choir of boys and men. Now they had connected to the synagogue, there was a yeshiva, which also functioned sort of as a choir school, where young boys went to learn liturgy and to learn singing. Now, some of the music that we have are for those forces, and they were for continuo and obligato instrument and later organ. Notice here at the bottom of the screen, we go back to these musicians, they're playing continuo, voice, and obligato. There also exists two oratorios, one which is still extant with a full orchestra. Now, their musical language integrates Sephardic Hazanut with Baroque and classical music, notably in the French and Italian styles that were popular in Amsterdam of its day. And they come together to make their own Sephardic musical idiom. Let's go look at some important collections. Where could we find this music today? The most important collection is in itself a library. It's called Itzchayim Livraria Montesinos, and adjoining the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. It is the oldest functioning Jewish library in the world, from 1616 to 1675. It was inaugurated in 1675, but collections began in about 1616. Musical manuscripts and resources dated from the 17th century are present and preserved there. It is ongoing, digitalization is ongoing. Some of it has already been digitized. Now within it is what we call several books that we call the Santo Servicio. It's a collection in the Chaim library, usually referred to as the Santo books, containing the yearly sacred cycle. And most were written for the Santo Servicio choir and were notated in 1886, though it contains older music that has been harmonized later. This is what that sounds like. It is beautiful music, and it is very rarely heard outside of the synagogue. And it's also for forces that we in the Western music community are lucky to have and are lucky to be able to share. There's also the library of the Shangarei Hashamayim Synagogue in London, which is the English counterpart to the synagogue in Amsterdam, that was founded from representatives from Amsterdam when Oliver Cromwell invited the Jews back to England, where they had been expelled since the 13th century. There's the Colección a Manuel Aguilar. Now, these are melodies transmitted by Sephardic cantor David Aaron de Sola and arranged by Aguilar in the mid-19th century. According to de Sola, who moved to London in 1818, the music in this collection is much older, and he learned it as a child. The last collection that I'd really like to point to you today is the Colección David Ricardo. Now, this is a short collection of music containing many codices. That's the Prayer for the Dead, for solo cantor and choir, notated by the Cantor Ricardo, who was a cantor at the synagogue in Amsterdam prior to World War II, and he is a Holocaust survivor. It was made in part to reconstitute the music destroyed by the Holocaust, when most of the community in Amsterdam was deported to their deaths. It is of special interest to the Holocaust studies and also to researchers in oral memory. let's look at some composers and repertoire that you might consider when planning a concert. Our first composer is Isaac Abuad de Fonseca, excuse me. And he is really the oldest figure that we have that we can attribute some music to. He was born in Portugal. He was born a new Christian in Portugal. And he escaped sometime in his early life to Amsterdam. And we have some early unaccompanied liturgical song that is attributed to him. If you came upon his name earlier, it might be because he was one of the synagogue elders who excommunicated a philosopher heretic called Baruch de Spinoza. That's usually how non-Jews think of him. Our next composer is Abraham Cáceres. He flourished between 1718 and 1740. He writes liturgical and paraliturgical music for one or many voices with basso continuo and sometimes an obbligato instrument. This goes back to what we were saying with that slide. Down here, we have our obbligato instrument, we have our voice soloist, and we have our continuo. He's also one of the composers that is in this booklet right here that you can find at its Chaim Library. There with him, in this collection, is the music of Abraham Raton. And he writes some unaccompanied psalms and small, what we would call cantatas today, for Jewish holidays like Shavuot and Sukkot for continuo and obbligato instruments. And we also have several large choruses from him. We have several standalone pieces of music of sacred and secular genres by members or associates from the community. And those could be very charming because they're so broad and so diverse. We wouldn't be complete without mentioning Marcello Benedetto. Now, he's not from Amsterdam at all. He is a Venetian composer. And in his Estro Poetico Armonico, there are 11 melodies. Now, these melodies come from what he says is the Venetian ghetto. He comes to the Venetian ghetto in search of antiquity, in search of what it might have sounded like back in the days of the temple, even though he himself was not Jewish. You could read more about him and his work if you look up Francesco Spagnuolo's work. He is a musicologist who is an expert on him. There are 11 melodies. There are 6 from the Ashkenazi tradition and 5 from the Sephardic tradition that he then sets in polyphonic settings while searching for musical antiquity. That's really important. He was doing the same thing that some of us do when we look at Sephardic music as early music. But he was doing it in the 18th century. We also have Cristiano Giuseppe Lidarti. Now, he's very important because he is, again, not Jewish. He's an Italian working in Amsterdam, and he's employed by the Jewish community to write large-scale Jewish music. We have liturgical, paraliturgical music from him, incidental music, and believe it or not, a full oratorio in Hebrew, in Sephardic Hebrew, telling us the story of Esther, which was performed 2 years ago in Boston. I will show you a clip from that so you get the idea of what this music sounds like. exciting music. And at last, we have David Abraham de Sola. He was originally from Amsterdam, but he relocated from Amsterdam to London to take up leadership of the London Sephardic Synagogue that I mentioned earlier. He wrote for cantor and choir, often with organ accompaniment, except on Shabbat. No organ is allowed on Shabbat. His son actually immigrated to America, and he was the first rabbi to open Congress after the election of Ulysses S. Grant. That's significant because Ulysses S. Grant was also the only person in American history who, acting as the capacity of a United States representative, expelled Jews from an American territory in Galveston, Texas during the Civil War. His Adon Olam remains a favorite of Sephardic congregations worldwide. I'm going to show you it in the context of a synagogue service so you can see what Minhag Anglia sounds like, the English custom. So to conclude, Sephardic music accompanies a vast array of stylistically diverse repertoire composed by Jews of the Sephardic Diaspora and non-Jews alike across Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas in the time span of 4 centuries. Beginning in the 1970s, the early music community began to show interest in Judeo-Spanish repertoire from the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. And over the ensuing several decades, a detailed mythology has emerged from the early music performance tradition regarding the origins, the content, and the performance style and the performance heritage of Judeo-Spanish music, creating sort of an imagined Sepharad for both practitioners and audiences alike. And when we can deconstruct this mythology, there is a rich Sephardic repertoire of modern Eastern Mediterranean music, as well as a treasury of Sephardic music from the Baroque, Classical, Romantic periods in the Western tradition that is largely yet to be explored in its context by historically informed performers such as us, and is waiting to be explored, and might be, in my opinion, more appropriate for our forces that we have and our education and our background that we have. On the other side of your screen, this is a bouquet of flowers collected in the Garden of the Arts, a collection of 50 treatises on the arts, including music, by Salomón de Oliveira. Thank you so much. Merci mucho and happy playing. I'm going to leave you with this lost oratorio. It is the oratorio of Beata Mashiach, or the Coming of the Messiah. It is a libretto by David de Franco Mendes in 1771. It's a Jewish answer to Handel's Messiah. Now, the music is either lost or it was never composed. But wouldn't it have been amazing if we had a Jewish Messiah oratorio? Thank you so much.
So we have several questions, and if anyone else has questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function, or you can post them in the comments on Facebook if you're watching on Facebook right now. But let's just go ahead and jump into some of these questions. One that's probably the most important at this point is if you had mentioned if people would like to reach out, that they could drop you a line, and how can they do that?
Right. Okay. I will type my email in the chat box.
Excellent.
Did everybody get it? Oh, only you got it. Hold on. Let me try that again. Panelists and attendees. Here we go.
All right. Question here. As clarifying question, do you see the codifying of Sephardic music as, quote, early, as primarily connected to Orientalist song collections of the early 20th century, or to like the Saval recordings and what happened in the later 20th century?
What a great question. Who asked that?
Lucy Barnhouse.
Lucy. Hi, Lucy. Wonderful that you can make it. I see it as a post-World War II tradition. I feel like the expansion of the early music community at the same time, coinciding with new social revolutions, such as the hippie movement in the United States, and different freedom movements throughout Europe, as well as Eastern Europe, and the feeling that music was being ignored, which is it's very much in the ethos of the early music movement. To find music that's been ignored and to perform it was part of, if not most of, the motivation to find this music. I hope that answers your question.
And then we have a question from Krishna Alexandra, who said she's been studying Ladino music for the past 20 years and has come across a small handful of Ladino songs that were recorded complete with melodies prior to 1600, presumed to have predate the expulsion. These pieces include La Mujer Engañada, now known as Nani Nani, which is recorded by in De Salinas de Música, and which appears in multiple 16th century song collections under a different title. Is there what do you know about that? Was there
so there were several people around the turn of the century who were saying that this is ancient music and this is something we found in song collections. Again, one of the reasons, well, we know this is later music for 3 reasons. Number one, we can't actually find it in a complete form in any songbook. We might find hints of words and of theme, but there's no melodic material that we can really pin down. The second is it's stylistically divergent. And that to me, that means that we know what 14th, 15th, and 16th century Iberian sources and Iberian music sound like and look like on the page. And we also know what modern late Ottoman music looks like and sounds like on the page. And this is stylistically divergent from 15th, 16th, and 17th century music, and stylistically convergent to Ottoman music. And the third way we know that this is contrafacta is that we know where the contrafacta comes from. In other words, the contrafacta isn't just Sephardic. We know it in its original source, whether it is Balkan music or Greek music or Turkish music. We also have that And that's how we know.
We had another question about who said, "Could you please give some examples?"
Edith Cohen is correct, by the way.
Oh,
She just expanded on my answer in the box.
question here was can you offers examples of influence of Bosnian Sevda songs to Ladino melodies or songs, and maybe
Yeah, absolutely. We find influence of the surrounding culture, especially in wedding songs. And this is because local musicians were also employed at Sephardic weddings. We have in Sarajevo, we have lots of Bulgarian influence, Bulgarian sung influence, Bulgarian sometimes even polyphonic influences. People singing different parts in a Bulgarian style or in a Serbian style, and we have Roma influence, we have Turkish influence, and that is because these musicians all collaborated at some point, notably in week-long Sephardic wedding songs we have. Judith Weishahach wrote quite a bit about that in Orbis Musicae.
Then a group of questions that are sort of I'll pull them together. So we're assuming the notation of the pieces that you discussed is probably idiomatic of the period. Does it manifest any different ways in these pieces, the Baroque pieces, or anything like that, or is it just what we would expect? And then, as tied in with that, obviously using the Hebrew language, it was most likely written in Hebrew script, and so how easy would it be for modern musicians to approach this music?
It's sometimes, but not always, written in Hebrew script. A lot of times, I should say that Western Sephardic Hebrew is different than modern Hebrew, and in many of the sources, they're actually writing out phonetically. Very similar to what we do in America when we write out Hebrew phonetically. Other times not. Other times it is in Hebrew. As we go forward and as more and more is exposed, we have new editions coming out. The Israel Music Center just published a new edition of the Lidarti, a new performance edition, and that's what Miriam Ensemble used when we did it in Boston a few years ago. Some of them, mostly though, are in what you would expect from any Western music notation.
Question. This is something that I think is sort of bridges the how do we address the field of early music in general, but the question is, you gave us a great summary of what Jewish and Sephardic music are, but what exactly would then early music be? Can the rep that is from the beginning of the 20th century be considered and approached as early? So I think this is more of a historical performance practice sort of question.
What a great question. You guys are asking wonderful questions, everybody. Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope that we approach these with the same attention to detail and the same attention to musical accuracy as we do Baroque music, except we shift our attention to the early 20th century. Imagine we are at a bar a nightclub, drinking coffee in Istanbul, and the smoke is in the air. What would they have been playing? What were their instrumental forces? What was their background likely to be? These are all wonderful ideas that we should take from our own background as historically informed musicians and apply in good faith to that music instead of creating our own tradition. Part of the issue with the early Saval recordings and the other recordings that come from that genre is that they start with a collection that is intentionally wiped clean performance practice, such as the Isaac Levy collection. So we take that and then we place on top of it what we imagine it would have sounded like if it had been in Spain at that time. which it wasn't, and that is our product, which isn't really what early music is about. Early music is about delving into the time period in which it was from, no matter when it's from, no matter if it was from 1930 or 1330. So I think it would benefit from that sort of approach. Yes.
What is the state of scholarship on early Sephardic traditions and music specifically in Israel?
That's a wonderful question. There is work. There has been wonderful work being done, especially since the 1980s. Edwin Sarusi really is your go-to guy for that. Mark Kirschenbaum also has done quite a bit. He's done some of the only recordings of non-Ladino music, but Sephardic music nonetheless. It really was, as Judith Cohen's Shoshana Vaishahak was incredibly instrumental. And there's a lot in Israel right now. A lot of the scholarship is in Hebrew, but you should really look at Shoshana Vaishahak and Edwin Sarusi.
And then a question about the origins of, and you'll have to forgive me if I don't pronounce it correctly, Piyutim? P-I-Y-Y-U-T-I-M.
You got it right. You got it right. So, okay. Piyutim is in itself a poetic tradition. It's an ancient tradition. Piyut comes from the Greek word poet, which means poet, right? Poetry. And they are paraliturgical music done at sometimes different times of the year, and each community has their own approach to piyutim. So a Moroccan piyut will sound different from a Turkish piyut. A lot of what we sing in synagogue is actually piyut. The Chadodi, what most Jewish communities sing every single Shabbat, every single Friday night, is actually a piyut. So it really is community specific as to when it's from. But again, mostly modern melodies. We have authors of piyut. Then I want to say the authors of the text going back to Spain, but not the music. Again, I don't want to start any myths myself. It is a poetic tradition that we then put music on top of.
And the last is more of just an observation as someone's, I think, doing dutiful work looking at Grove right now as they're speaking, but just noticing that even though there's been a bunch of recent scholarship on Lidarti, that the Grove article currently has nothing about his Jewish heritage, about Esther,
Lidarti wasn't Jewish. He was just hired by the Jewish community. He was a very in vogue, very popular Italian musician that everybody wanted to hire in Amsterdam, and for the Jewish community, why wouldn't they want to employ the best? But the Grove tends to be, the encyclopedias in general tend to be behind, because their job is to condense the scholarship, condense the information that's putting out there into an article and put it online for everybody. So they always, no matter where you are in the field of musicology, encyclopedias will tend to lag behind, just like textbooks.
Well, I think that's we've exhausted the current questions. There may be some people who are typing madly to send you a personal email, but we'll leave that to your own conversations.
And if I can't answer it, I'll get you to somebody who can. And I want to thank Early Music America so much and all of our attendees. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope you're able to learn something that you can put in your practice as historically informed performers.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Ian Pomerantz, for being here, and for everyone who's joined us both on Zoom and on Facebook. And we will put this onto our YouTube channel. It will be there sometime later tomorrow so that you can go back over it. You can explore the composers and the pieces and the material at your leisure. And that will stay there along with all of our other webinars and interest sessions that we have hosted over this past year. So once again, Ian, thank you so much for being here. And to everyone else, we hope you have a pleasant evening, and we'll see you next time.
Happy Hanukkah.